Yet nobody knows why you are aware right now. Not why you are watching this video. Not why you have opinions, preferences, memories. The question is simpler and more radical than that. Why is there any subjective experience at all? Why isn't all of this neural processing just happening in the dark, with nobody home? David Chalmers named this the hard problem of consciousness in 1996. And despite extraordinary advances in neuroscience since then, it remains completely unsolved. We know an enormous amount about how the brain processes information. We still don't know why any of it feels like anything. I want to offer you a physical answer today. Not a philosophical metaphor, but a mechanism, one with equations behind it, one that makes predictions testable in a laboratory. A theory I call CERTS. But to understand the physics, we first have to do a small amount of philosophy. Because without the right philosophical foundation, the physics won't make sense. There is a dialogue preserved from the 1st century AD between the Greek king Menander, who ruled in what is now Kashmir, a remnant of Alexander's conquests, and a Buddhist sage named Nagasena. The king has come to the source of the Ganges River and he is troubled. He says, "I have been coming to this river since I was a small boy, throwing pebbles into it. I came later as a warrior, then as a husband, a father, a statesman, and now as an old man nearly powerless. And in all that time, the river has never stopped changing. The water changes. The stones roll. The banks shift. The fish come and go. Nothing here is permanent. And when I look at myself, my body, my thoughts, my ambitions at each stage of life, nothing in me is constant either. So tell me, wise Nagasena, what is truly permanent in this universe?" Nagasena looked at him and said, "Think again. It is precisely this awareness with which you have observed that river across all these years, that has not moved from its point at all. It is always present in exactly the same way. It is not conditioned by anything. The act of observation itself. The point of observation. That is what doesn't change. And here is what is remarkable about that insight from a physics standpoint. That point of observation exists in a perpetual present. Not in the past except when we think about memories. Not in the future except when we plan. Always here, always now. A singularity in time. Physics has something very precise to say about phenomena that exist outside of time. We will come back to that. Segment 2, why the EM field and nothing else, the brain. 86 billion neurons. 100 trillion synaptic connections. Burning 20% of the body's total energy in a 1.4 kilogram structure. Producing what exactly? The standard answer is computation. The neurons fire, signals propagate, patterns emerge, and somehow that produces consciousness. But as an electrical engineer, I see at least 3 things deeply wrong with that account. Let me walk you through all 3. The first problem is information integration. When you perceive a green apple, you are simultaneously experiencing roundness, greenness, sweetness, crunchiness, the memory of the last time you ate one, perhaps a slight sense of hunger. All of these features are processed in completely separate, spatially distant regions of the brain: visual cortex, taste areas, memory structures, emotional centers. What integrates them? What takes these separate neural activities and binds them into one unified perception? Professor John Joe McFadden at the University of Surrey has pointed out something fundamental. There is no other mechanism that can do this except the electromagnetic field of the brain. Nothing else is physically present everywhere at once. Neurons fire locally. Axons are fixed cables. But the EM field of the brain is a single entity spanning the entire cranium, touching everything simultaneously. The second problem is phase synchronization. Wolfsinger at the Max Planck Institute showed that when you recognize a concept, any concept, diverse brain regions must come into phase coherence. They oscillate at exactly the same frequency. Resonance. Here is the engineering problem. These regions can be 20 centimeters apart. The axonal white matter connecting them is fixed hardware, not software. As any electrical engineer knows from four-pole network theory, you cannot make two circuits with different impedance characteristics oscillate at the same phase through a fixed cable unless you have carefully matched their RLC components. The fixed anatomy of the brain cannot do this for the infinite variety of concepts we perceive moment to moment. Huygens clock pair, two pendulums on a wall synchronizing. Think of Huygens pendulum clocks. The Dutch physicist who discovered that two pendulums hanging on the same wall will eventually synchronize, not by touching each other directly, but through the mechanical waves in the wall between them. The brain does exactly this, but with electromagnetic waves instead of mechanical ones. The AM field is the wall. The only wireless medium in the cranium is the electromagnetic field. It is the only channel through which separated regions can enter the same phase at the same moment. The third problem is energetic. Your brain right now is spending approximately 15 watts just to continuously pump ions across neural membranes. That is 20% of your entire body's energy budget for a structure weighing 1.4 kilograms. From an evolutionary standpoint, this is an enormous commitment. Natural selection does not waste energy on that scale without a reason. The axon firing, all that ionic pumping, is not primarily computing. It is generating the electromagnetic field. The neurons are not computers in the classical sense. They are antennas. They both emit and receive. Look at how a dendrite is shaped. It looks exactly like an antenna array. Because it is an antenna array, it samples disturbances in the local electromagnetic field. This is the semi-theory of consciousness, conscious electromagnetic information, developed by Professor McFadden. The AM field is not a byproduct of neural activity. It is the neural correlate of consciousness itself. The computation happens in the synapses. The experience happens in the field. McFadden is correct that nothing else can integrate information the way the field does. But SEMI needs a mechanism. How exactly does the electromagnetic field produce the subjective experience? What is the physical process by which a field becomes a feeling? For that we need quantum mechanics. In 1986, physicist John Cramer at the University of Washington published what I consider one of the most important papers in modern physics. The Transactional Interpretation of Quantum Mechanics, or TIQM. You know the double-slit experiment. A photon leaves an emitter, passes through two slits simultaneously as a wave, because quantum mechanics requires this, and then hits a detector. At the moment of detection, the wave collapses. The photon was everywhere, now it is at one point. The standard Copenhagen interpretation says, don't ask where it was before detection. Cramer asks the question differently. He says a photon travels as an alpha wave going forward in time. When it reaches a potential absorber, something capable of absorbing its energy, that absorber sends back a confirmation wave traveling backward in time. The transaction completes when offer and confirmation handshake. That handshake constitutes what we call the collapse of the wave function. And it completes in zero proper time. Zero proper time. This is not a metaphor. It follows directly from special relativity. For any object traveling at the speed of light, the spacetime interval ds squared equals c squared dt squared minus dx squared equals 0. This is the null geodesic condition, the boundary of Minkowski geometry along which proper time vanishes. Between the emission and absorption of a photon, no time passes. The photon exists outside of time. Let this land. Do you see what just happened? The act of observation, the conscious moment, the Nagasna singularity that exists in the eternal present, it is grounded in the physics of photons. The electromagnetic phenomena that do not experience time. Fig 3 spatial architecture, two channels converge on thalamic focal point. Now, let us look at the brain's architecture. The cortex forms a roughly spherical shell. At the center of that shell sits the thalamus, a structure about the size of a walnut at the geometric center of the brain. The thalamus is the point equidistant from every point on the cortical surface. Its position is not accidental. The thalamus has been known for decades as the gateway to consciousness. It regulates sleep and waking. It sustains the 40 Hz gamma rhythm that characterizes conscious states. Damage to the thalamus abolishes consciousness far more completely than damage to most of the cortex. In CERTS, the thalamus is not just a gateway. It is the geometric focal point of the quantum transaction that constitutes consciousness. In cortical neurons, there are structures called microtubules, protein scaffolding that gives cells their shape and organizes internal transport. In 2018, Cantero and colleagues demonstrated that microtubule bundles have an electromechanical resonance at precisely 39 Hz. A 258% change in ionic conductance at that frequency. Now, the thalamocortical system generates a 40 Hz electromagnetic field. This field permeates every neuron in the cortex simultaneously. The microtubules resonate at 39 Hz. The driving field is at 40 Hz. 1 Hz difference. As any electrical engineer will tell you, drive a resonator at near resonance and it will oscillate. And tubulin, the protein that forms microtubules, has an enormous electric dipole moment of 1,800 dBi. One of the largest known for any biological protein. A structure with a dipole moment that large, driven by an oscillating field near its resonant frequency, must absorb energy and begin coherent mechanical oscillation. This is not speculation. This is classical electrodynamics. Approximately 1 to 10% of cortical microtubules enter this coherent phase-locked state at any given moment. These are the microtubules contributing to the current conscious frame. The rest are background noise. Fig 5 TIQM transaction cycle, both panels, offer wave left, confirmation avalanche right now comes the quantum event. The phase-locked microtubule ensemble, all oscillating coherently, emits what we call a phonon offer wave. Phonons are quantized mechanical vibrations, the acoustic analog of photons for light. At 39 Hz, the wavelength in brain tissue is approximately 38 meters. The brain is 15 centimeters across. Every microtubule in the coherent subset is therefore within a tiny fraction of a wavelength of every other. They are all phase-aligned. In quantum mechanics, n-phase-locked emitters in superposition do not produce n-independent offer waves. They produce one collective quantum state, the sum over all emitters of their individual quantum states, divided by the square root of n. One offer wave. Informationally flat, reaching every potential absorber in the brain with equal weight. The absorbers respond. Every microtubule or chromophore in the brain that is phase-matched returns a confirmation wave. But the confirmations are not equal. Each carries the local quantum state of that absorber, a state that has been perturbed by local biophotons emitted by nearby mitochondria. The local metabolic state of each cortical column has been encoded into the local microtubule lattice through a process called first decoupling. The confirmation wave carries that local content back. Billions of confirmation waves converge simultaneously on the thalamic focal point. The focal point sits at the geometric center of the cortical shell, the point of maximum constructive interference from the entire coherent ensemble. Their superposition, the pattern of which absorbers confirmed, with what phase carrying what locally encoded content, constitutes what CERTS calls the conscious readout. This is the unified conscious moment. It completes in zero proper time, along null geodesics, outside the metric domain of biological tissue. Exactly as the Nagasena singularity suggests. The cortical microtubule ensemble, whose quantum state encodes the brain's current integrated state, interrogates itself through the act of transacting. There is no external observer. The system reads itself. This self-referential quality, the fact that the experience feels like it is happening to you, not observed from outside, this is the physical correlate of the first-person character of consciousness. CERTS calls this architecture a phonon TIQM channel, and the theory's full name reflects what happens at its core. The emitter is the observer. The thalamus is the quantum mirror. Glucose to conscious perception. Let me show you the complete causal chain. This diagram shows the full CERTS architecture from glucose metabolism to conscious perception, cycling 40 times per second. Glucose into mitochondrial oxidative phosphorylation, producing biophoton emission in the 350 to 800 nanometer range. These biophotons travel 1 to 3 millimeters within the cortical column and are absorbed by the microtubule tryptophan network via first coupling. This is the content encoding step. The metabolic state of this neuron right now, what feature it is currently representing, is now written into the quantum state of the local microtubule lattice. Simultaneously, the 40 Hz thalamocortical field phase locks the coherent microtubule subset. This is the carrier, the clock signal running 40 times per second. The microtubule lattice emits quantized 39 Hz phonons as a collective quantum off a wave. The conformation avalanche converges on the thalamic focal point. Conscious perception. 0 proper time. Repeat 40 times per second. The key architectural principle is the division of labor. Biophotons encode local content, phonons perform global binding. Each mechanism does the work it is physically suited for. Neither is asked to do work it cannot do. Fig 8 cerebellar exclusion table. Region by region. Now I want to show you one of the strongest structural arguments for this theory. The cerebellar exclusion. The cerebellum contains approximately 80% of all neurons in the human brain. Far more than the entire cerebral cortex. And yet, patients born without a cerebellum have normal subjective consciousness. Cerebellar damage produces coordination problems and movement disorders. It does not produce unconsciousness or any loss of subjective experience whatsoever. 80% of brain neurons, zero contribution to consciousness. Any theory that ties consciousness to neuron count or synaptic activity cannot explain this. CERTS explains it mechanistically, through 3 conditions that must all be satisfied for a brain region to contribute to the conscious frame. Condition 1: frequency match. The 40 Hz thalamocortical field must be able to phase lock microtubules at 39 Hz. Cerebellar circuits run at 6 to 10 Hz theta and 100 to 200 Hz fast gamma. No 40 Hz component exists in the cerebellum. Without it, no microtubule entrainment. No phonon offer wave. Condition 2: geometric inclusion. The cortex forms a roughly spherical shell around the thalamic focal point. Conformation waves from anywhere on that shell converge on the center with 0 path length difference, perfect constructive interference, the n-squared coherent gain. The cerebellum sits posterior and inferior to the thalamic center, outside this shell. Conformations from cerebellar absorbers would converge on a completely different geometric point. They never reach the conscious readout. Condition 3: architectural connection. The cerebellum is not embedded in the bidirectional thalamocortical loop that sustains the 40 Hz phase locking. It outputs to the cortex, but through a one-way relay, not a resonant bilateral loop. 3 independent failures. Each alone would exclude the cerebellum. All 3 together is not coincidence. It is a reflection of what the cerebellum actually is, a fast, feed-forward computation engine, not a binding substrate. The same 3-condition framework handles the hippocampus beautifully. Partial frequency match through theta-gamma coupling, but offset geometry and only indirect thalamic access, so the hippocampus makes a partial, content-specific contribution. Damage to it does not abolish consciousness. It abolishes the encoding of new episodes. Exactly what the 3 conditions predict. physical theory of consciousness must make falsifiable predictions. CERTS generates 35 of them. Let me show you the most striking. Look at this diagram. The 40Hz thalamocortical drive and the 39Hz microtubule resonance are separated by exactly 1 Hz. That gap is not an accident. It is a safety margin. If you drive a resonator at exactly its resonant frequency with sufficient gain, you get runaway amplification. In RF engineering, we call this an oscillatory instability. We deliberately detune our circuits. We operate close to resonance for maximum coupling, but not exactly at resonance. The brain does the same engineering. 1% off-center frequency is a typical choice for a moderately high Q resonator. The two oscillators drift in and out of phase at the beat frequency, 40-39 equals 1 Hz, and this 1 Hz beat cycle modulates the strength of each TIQM transaction. Maximum strength at phase alignment. Suppressed at phase opposition. The cycle repeats once per second. What happens if the gap collapses? The beat frequency goes to 0. Phase alignment becomes permanent. Every transaction fires at maximum strength, continuously with no suppression phase. That is a seizure. That is the physical signature of epilepsy in the CERTS architecture. CERTS makes a specific testable prediction. At the focal point of an epileptic discharge, the local gamma frequency should converge toward 40 Hz, toward the thalamocortical drive frequency, as the 1 Hz gap closes. Measurable with high-density MEG. And in the healthy brain, the 1 Hz beat cycle itself is the natural wandering of the mind. The moment between thoughts. The micro-gap in focused attention. Consciousness modulates at 1 Hz by the beat frequency of its own carrier. Sustained focused attention is effortful precisely because you are working against this natural drift cycle. Fig 6 Nyquist-Shannon sampling applied to conscious perception here is another prediction I find elegant. If consciousness is a discrete frame process at 39 Hz, then the Nyquist-Shannon theorem, a fundamental theorem of signal processing that every engineer knows, makes a direct prediction about perceptual limits. A system sampling at frequency f can only resolve signals up to f divided by 2. For a 39 Hz conscious sampler, that is 19.5 Hz. Approximately 20 Hz. That is the critical flicker fusion frequency. The well-established psychophysical threshold above which a flickering light appears continuous. Measured for over a century, consistently near 20 Hz for foveal vision under photopic conditions. Cinema runs at 24 frames per second, just above the Nyquist limit, and you perceive it as continuous motion. CERTS derives this directly from first principles. It is not a parameter fit. It is a consequence of the mechanism. The same 39 Hz sampling rate applied through standard signal processing relationships gives you the Libet delay of approximately 500 milliseconds for new stimuli to enter conscious integration, the attentional blink window of 200 to 500 milliseconds, the temporal binding window of 100 to 200 milliseconds, minimum reaction times of 100 to 150 milliseconds. These famous psychophysical constants are not separate empirical facts to be explained individually. In CERTS, they all fall out of a single underlying parameter. The theory also has strong clinical support. Right here in Zagreb, Professors Deletis and Chuddy at Dubrava University Hospital have conducted the longest sustained program of thalamic deep brain stimulation in patients with disorders of consciousness anywhere in the world, over a decade of consecutive cases. 22% of implanted patients showed significant recovery, including patients who emerged from vegetative state to full communication and independent living. And crucially, the structural follow-up by Ragaj and colleagues showed that successful recovery was accompanied by measurable volumetric increases in cortical structures, direct evidence that restoring the thalamocortical carrier drives cortical reorganization. The thalamus is not reporting on the state of the cortex. It is actively shaping it. Exactly what CERTS predicts. Let me come back to where we started. King Menander at the river. The question of what doesn't change. Nagasna's answer was the act of observation itself, always present, always the same, not conditioned by anything existing in the eternal now. CERTS gives that answer a physical address. The thalamic focal point. A region about 1.5 centimeters across, at the geometric center of the brain. The point where billions of confirmation waves converge 40 times per second, each carrying the locally encoded content of the cortical column that sent it, their superposition constituting the unified conscious moment. That point exists in zero proper time. The transaction completes along null geodesics, outside the metric domain of biological tissue. The eternal now of the Nagasna singularity corresponds, in the language of physics, to the null interval of the TIQM transaction. ds squared equals 0. On T, the philosophical and physical answers converge on the same point. Is CERTS correct? That is for experiment to determine, and I genuinely don't know yet. The theory makes 35 falsifiable predictions. Some are accessible right now with current instrumentation. The electron-phonon coupling efficiency in microtubule bundles, the phonon propagation length in brain tissue at 39 Hz, the coherence index in disorders of consciousness, the gamma frequency convergence signature at epileptic foci. The thalamic DBS program here in Zagreb is, without knowing it, already testing one of the most important predictions. What I can say with confidence is this: CERTS is not a metaphor. It is a mechanism. Grounded in classical electrodynamics, in established microtubule biophysics, and in the universal Wheeler-Feynman transactional framework that Kramer and Mead developed. It makes contact with testable biology at every step. The question, why is there something it is like to be you right now, reading this, may finally have a physical answer. Thank you.